Mostly we're just going to be reviewing season extension. I'm going to talk a little bit about vegetable farming over winter here in the Midwest. And you'll notice on your, so we don't really have any handouts because we were initially not sure if we were actually going to be able to travel. I didn't find out I was able to travel until Friday. So this was kind of originally designed as a virtual class, but I wanted to get people out here because I also wanted to take some soil samples since we didn't get to do that last time because of the rain. So you notice like on the evaluation, there's a reviewing how, there's a section that says, review how to interpret a soil test. Since we did that last time, we are not going to do that this time. So we're really just only covering basically just a review of season extension and talking a little about winter farming. I'm gonna go through a little slideshow. I'm also gonna show you some videos, mostly from Curtis Stone, the urban farmer, just about that sort of thing, because it's nice to actually see some visuals of people doing this in the real world. But again, as always, feel free to interrupt or if you have any questions about anything as we go into this. Before we really get started, anybody have any questions or concerns from the last class or your own as you're cleaning up your little garden or farm plot? Anything that's come to mind where you're like, oh, I wonder about this? Nope. OK, all right. Everybody's really 100% good to go. Awesome. OK. So today we're talking about season extension. Before I move on, who can remember what season extension is? What's the purpose of it?
To extend the growing season past the normal thing because the temperature's changing?
Yeah, basically. And then that can extend both before the main growing season and after the main growing season. So we first had this a class about season extension back in, I want to say April, maybe late March. I'd have to double check the calendar because we were talking then about like getting started and getting prepped early. And now what we're really talking about is like, okay, what does that look like then at the end of the season if we want to keep things going? So season extension is methods to grow produce for more months out of the year or outside of normal growing season. Normal growing season here is roughly April through October. Once we're getting pretty close here to when it's going to be less than 10 hours of daylight. And when we get less than 10 hours of daylight, that really slows things down. It really reduces the rate at which things grow. Lower temperatures certainly also help that, but that doesn't seem to be an issue this year. Considering it is October 11th and 81 outside right now, and I am in shorts. Temperature and really daylight are big limiting factors here as we go into the winter season. So oftentimes what our season extension is doing at this end of the season is really just trying to eke out as much heat as we can to keep things going and growing. Or at least keep them from being damaged by frost is really a main thing. So some examples of season extension, again, we've talked about these before. So there's the row covers, which is that fabric stuff. We saw that out in the field this spring. We had it up on hoops. You can also lay it right across the crop too. You can see in this picture here. They've just laid it all across the field. There's, it's easy to do just across the field, I think, and that can be fast and it can be good for doing a bigger area because the hoops, obviously, then some of that fabric goes vertical. But the one thing to be concerned about when you do that is it potentially going to be harming whatever crop you are using when you're dragging it off? So you have to be a little bit more careful when you're removing it when you don't have the hoops. The hoops, though, they give that little structure, but then it can be, sometimes that can actually be a bit more of a challenge to actually get in and get access to the plants then, because the hoops are in the way of harvesting sometimes, depending on what you're doing. So you might do hoops for some crops and just flat for others. It all kind of depends on what you are most comfortable with and what you like more, and whether you can trust yourself to be careful not to damage things by ripping off the fabric just off of them if it's just laying on top of them. So yeah, and you'll see when this is also called When it's just on the crops directly, that's called floating row cover, typically speaking. But it's a great way to cover a big area. And again, you just want to make sure you're getting it weighted down so it doesn't blow away. This is the same sort of thing. This is low tunnels with plastic instead of the row cover. So the row cover, like in here, basically comes in 3 different weights. There's a really, really lightweight one, which is mostly for insect protection, because we talked about that in the springtime as protection from flea beetles and other spring pests. But then there's medium and heavyweight if you really want to be protecting from frost damage. So oftentimes it behooves you as a grower to keep multiple sets of the different thicknesses essentially for different parts of the year. Though if your space is limited and your funds are limited, I usually like to go with just a medium weight row cover for either side. That's usually pretty good. When you're doing plastic, the main thing with plastic is, unlike the row cover, it does not let water and air through. So that's kind of a downside, that you'll have to actually irrigate, make sure you're irrigating more if you're using that, usually speaking, if you're doing this in the summer, especially when it's hot or it's very sunny. The upside of it is it gets things a lot warmer. So this is much better for actually like improving the temperature more so than the fabric. Fabric will hold in a little, but the plastic will really keep it warmer. Now we've talked about how, like, when they're small like this, these low tunnels, they warm up and cool down fairly quickly. So you do have to be concerned about ventilation. So, like, if I had these set up a couple weeks ago because I'm anticipating, fall to happen, and then we turn around and have these 80-degree days, you really got to like basically open up the sides, make sure it's well ventilated. And honestly, like, at this point, we had that little like 4 or 5 days of fall weather a couple weeks back. If I were to have set these up and then seen what the weather was going to be, I probably would have actually removed them until it's going to get cold again. Just because otherwise you have to go out and back all the time to open and close them. And these are a little bit more problematic than if you're doing it in a greenhouse or some of the high tunnels, which will oftentimes you'll have a lot of times they'll have a mechanical way to actually roll up the sides. And you can build these, so like for high tunnels you can do that. For low tunnels it's not really practical. Now you'll see I'm going to show you a video of building low tunnels. That's actually quite nice, but I'll get to that in just a, no, I can do it right now. It's a nice video.
Are the holes on the one on the left to help with the ventilation, I'm assuming, or is that for something else?
Oh, this here? Yeah, that's for ventilation, yes. Yeah, so this one has holes in it. And now, so these are just hoops these ones are metal, these ones also look like metal. So one thing to be concerned about is, so a lot of people they get metal conduit from Lowe's or Home Depot, and a lot of times you'll see in the video I'm going to show you, like Curtis Stone has cobbled together this thing where he can bend it to the right length. So he uses 10-foot lengths of conduit, bends it to shape, and then uses that. The reason that they do conduit and not PVC pipe, which is just easily flexible on its own, is because the greenhouse plastic film, if it's in contact with the PVC, there's a chemical reaction that can happen that breaks down the plastic faster. Now, I've just read that a lot and had people tell me that a lot. I don't know how much faster. So, PVC is a lot more cheap than conduit. So there's, again, like I would say I would recommend using the metal conduit. You might be able to get away with PVC if you put a barrier between it and the plastic, like maybe some duct tape or possibly paint. But I am not sure how well that will work. The conduit is relatively easy to bend, but it is a little bit more expensive. So just be aware if you don't have a whole lot of money, you have to use PVC, Just be aware that you're going to burn through your plastic faster. Now, most folks, plastic, greenhouse plastic, even though it's designed to resist UV to a degree, but you still usually have to replace it every 3 to 5 years. 3 years is industry standard. A lot of folks wait until it's really so far gone that you can barely even see through it anymore because it can be expensive and it's a challenging task to put over, especially a bigger tunnel. But for this stuff, like these are little small, relatively small scraps and things. So this is easy to do. And yeah, so this one that has the holes in it, you can buy pre-perforated plastic specifically for low tunnels to improve ventilation. You're still probably going to have to lift the sides up if it's really warm or really sunny, but the ventilation definitely helps.
Do during my growing season is I will put them on a crop to start that crop, to establish it, to warm it up, warm up the soil, and warm up the germination of that crop to get it going faster. And then once it's established, I can take them off and put them on another crop to expedite it. So the main idea with these isn't necessarily to protect them from freezing. It's more to keep them warmer during the day to get more heat units on the soil to expedite your days to maturity. So by doing so, I can grow a crop like radishes that say has an average DTM of 28 days. And when you look in your seed catalog, that DTM only represents the sort of summer main season. And what it is in the spring or the fall will be slightly longer. But by using these, I can stretch out that period of my prime days to maturity for a longer point of the season. So that means with radishes, for example, I can plant radishes in April, cover them up with poly low tunnel, and get 28 days to maturity. Whereas if I planted radishes in April and put them in the ground with no tunnel, they might take 45 days. So it allows you to get to production quicker. The other thing I use them for is overwintering crops, primarily to keep snow off, but also moisture off to keep the soil from freezing, because if you go into your fall period like I'm in right now, we start to get a lot more precipitation. And then once you get these rains and then eventually snow, the soil stays wet because it doesn't dry out during the day. And that means when your temperatures go below freezing, especially for a considerable period of time, your soil will freeze, and then that will damage or really harm the chance of you getting that crop to harvest. Crops like carrots or other root crops are really important there, because if you have carrots in the ground and you plant them over winter, and if you haven't seen my carrot video on overwintering, you can click above here and you can watch that one. I also have overwintered spinach and kale, the same idea, using poly low tunnels. So what this does is it keeps that soil from having a really hard freeze because it keeps the moisture off. And so you might ask, well, how do you water them? Well, you water them if you have drip underneath. So this plot is on drip, so I don't have to worry about that. But in cases where you don't have drip, it is a little bit more labor to water them. So you'll have to open them every now and then and turn on your irrigation or hand water, however you're going to do it. But generally, when you're on the colder time of the season, you don't need to water nearly as much. So for us, at this time of year, I'm not even running the water at all. I might open these, I'll look at the soil, might open them once a week. If it looks dry, I'll turn on the water, but in this case, again, it's drip, so that's not an issue for me. So these tunnels are comprised of a handful of pretty inexpensive and accessible equipment. First and most important thing are the hoops. They are made of a 1/2-inch electrical conduit that are 10 feet long, and I bend them using just a do-it-yourself bender. I've built one of these with a piece of plywood, draw a curved line on there, and put in a bunch of 2x4 chunks, and bend them, slide them, bend them. It's really easy to do. So these will fit two 30-inch beds with anywhere between a 6 to 12-inch walkway in between. My walkways are 10 inches and they work fine for me. If you have 18-inch walkways, you might be stretching it, but I haven't tried 18-inch walkways, so I can't say for sure. The second thing, and also very important, is the poly. I'm just using a standard 6mm greenhouse poly, and I custom cut these by ordering a 20-foot wide by whatever length you want greenhouse poly roll, and I just cut it down the middle to make 10-foot wide pieces. A 10-foot wide piece is all you need to cover the curvature of your tunnel, because these tunnels are a few feet off the ground. So the third thing is I'm using, to make my ridge pole in the center, I'm using a 18-inch rebar stake with a little loop on the end and a piece of rope tied to it. So that isn't totally crucial to setting these up, but if you're going to be experiencing snow, it really helps the tunnels from collapsing in on themselves, and it keeps the entire structure tight, just like a greenhouse. Whereas if you don't have the rope, each hoop is going to be able to bend back and forth on its own. So if you succumb to some heavy winds, or again, if you get snow, the tunnels will collapse because the...
Yeah, so that's a really important point. That ridge pole is really critical for support. He has another video that talks about how he actually moved away from using rope and then using actually straps, so they're a little bit wider, providing some additional support. And sometimes, you might even be able to, depending on what you're using, like if you have like a caterpillar tunnel, which is what we'll talk about next, which is kind of the next size up, those might actually have a steel steel bracing down the middle. Again, more stability is really important for again, if you've got wind, which we have here, and if you've got snow, which we get here. So that support is definitely really critical. I'm going to kind of end this video here because basically you'll just see, I might speed it up. Let me...
Does he talk about any feedback from neighbors about his front yard?
Yeah. So his whole shtick is, or was, I guess he's moving to a property in the country now. He would rent his neighbors' yards or abandoned lots and then do this in them. And he has his own front yard, but he mostly worked on leased land. So and this is in Alberta, I think. So yeah, he's in Canada, but West Coast Canada.
Do you know any policies regarding abandoned land? Because a lot of farmers I know, they said they started community gardens just on abandoned land that was in their community.
Somebody owns it.
Right.
If you want to protect yourself from legal repercussions, you should contact the actual owner and get permission. So you can usually look up who owns different lots on your local tax assessor's website or ask them. I know, so in Springfield, you're which is where I live, you are able to look up the parcels and see who owns them, get a name at least, and you can try to track them down from there. Or one thing you could do is you could ask. So here, you could ask the Montgomery County Land Bank what land they own. I know you can buy land from them pretty cheaply, especially if you are a nonprofit organization. But even individuals, I want to say a city lot from them is anywhere between $250 and $600 to just buy the lot. The Montgomery County Land Bank. They have a program. They are looking to sell land to people who want to use it for gardening, farming, that sort of thing. So, yeah, and they have some properties here in Trotwood, a lot more in actual Dayton proper, West Dayton. And then there's or you can potentially ask the city development board. I know the Trotwood Development Company is very interested in this, and so they are going to be looking for people to either buy that land or use it for gardening and growing and stuff like that here in Trotwood. So I know there's actually some additional property in this whole development here that hasn't been bought by a developer yet. That's a potential option. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can shoot me an email. I can give you his name is Chad. I can give you his contact info. And so the other, also a lot of cities, you might not be aware, but a lot of cities have a program where if you live next to a vacant lot and somebody isn't taking care of it and you mow it regularly, you can just add that to your property. Dayton has one? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's another, if you happen to, yeah. Oh, you don't have one over?
The city of Dayton, so I used to work at the land bank.
Okay.
So we would get calls from folks who would say like, oh, I'm gonna take care of this property. And I don't know if the city ever had that program, like a long time ago, but it doesn't currently.
Okay.
So it's like, the land bank lots are super cheap.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of inventory. It's where their structures have been demolished.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good fill dirt that was put back in where the structures have been. But, like other lots that are owned by people that are tax delinquent have to go through a foreclosure process, which is thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
So it's like better to find the ones that are feasible through the land bank, because you're going to be able to get it a lot cheaper and a lot quicker, because if it has to go through foreclosure, it's like years. So
Great to know. Yeah, so yeah, I know Springfield has an abandoned lot thing, but you have to be literally, you have to be adjacent to it. The property you own has to be adjacent to it. Can't be across the street, can't be like one house over, have to be right next to it. But yeah, I'd say the land bank is probably your best bet around here, and talking to them and see what they have available. One thing you're going to want to make sure that there is water access, and if there is not, how much, get an estimate of how much it's going to cost you to get that access pipe put back in, because they probably removed it when they demolished the structure usually. So as long as at least there's a connection at the street, which there should be, but always want to make sure you check before you buy. But then you will have to spend some money. Do you have any idea of the cost usually to add water back on? I'm guessing between $500 and $1,000.
I know for the city of Dayton it's not cheap, because we've had people who were looking at like urban farm initiatives within the city, and that was a really big thing that came out of the budget. But I don't know the cost of it in the city probably.
Okay. So yeah, getting water added is not cheap, but you want to make sure that it's a lot harder to farm if you don't have access to water. Yeah. So he goes through this in the rest of this video. He sets up the hoops. So he's just sort of going through and setting it up, covering it with the plastic. He's got them put on. Let's see. I think there's.
So usually I have polytunnels that are cut for 25 and 50-foot beds. So if I'm going to have a piece of plastic for a 25-foot bed, I want to make sure that it's at least 6 feet longer than the bed itself. So if that was the case for a 25-foot bed, I'd want a 31-foot piece of plastic, and for a 50-foot bed, I would want a 56-foot piece of plastic. In this particular case, these are odd-shaped beds. They're 35 feet, so I'm using some scrap poly to make up the end, and then I'm clipping it halfway down the hoop, and that's where the spring clamps come in handy there, is that they allow you to piece these together if you've got odd-shaped beds here and there.
Yeah, so he uses spring clamps to help keep them together and to latch on at either end on these ones. I think, let's see, I'm going to pull up his one on winter carrots, because this is where he's done some carrots.
Winter blues getting you down? Are you missing the fresh, tasty, nutritionally dense vegetables that you had in the spring and summer from your garden? Get over it. I'm about to show you how you can have carrots in your garden all winter long, even in 2 feet of snow. That's coming up next on The Urban Farmer. These carrots were planted the first week of August. And planting them at that time gives me enough time for them to mature before it gets cold. And then we cover them up and then can leave them in the ground all winter. And that's actually the best place for them in some climates. In my climate, I only get, at the coldest, times we'll get minus 20 degrees Celsius, but not for very long. So right now we're back up to just a little bit above freezing, but we've had a lot of snow this winter. There's almost 2 feet of snow on the ground, and so I'm going to have to use my little snow shovel to dig the snow off these tunnels to get in there. So I do want to point out one critical error that I made doing this, and this is something that we should have done, but sometimes shit happens on the farm. These tunnels were not supported by ridge poles, and normally they are. Normally, as we go into the winter, we put a rope that ties all of the hoops together, and that creates strength, because what you can see here is that they're actually starting to dip down, and that has caused them to cave in a little bit. In the case of these carrots, it probably won't matter too much because they're in the ground, and what we did in the late fall, in late October, we actually went and cut the greens off these carrots so that they'll be easy to harvest in the winter. Because if you leave the greens on, they will die, rot down, and it'll be hard to see the ground when you're harvesting your carrots. So that's why we've done that. So it's going to make it easier in this case. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to put on my head cam and show you guys how this all goes, and we'll check back in at the end. All right, here we go.
So as you can see, yeah, so since he didn't have that support, his tunnel started collapsing. That's a good way to get the plastic damaged. And he's coming in here at the middle where he had clipped them together. So he can open that up, and that's a nice easy spot to get into. And again, it's important that he's removing that snow because again, it's easy to rip it if you're trying to lift it with a bunch of weight on
The
it.
reason I went into the middle and did this is because we had to piece together two pieces of 25-foot or 30-foot poly tunnels to fit this, and so these are longer beds. They're about 55 feet. So I went in the middle because it was starting to kind of cave in there, so I figured I might as well get the snow off there anyways. And I wasn't exactly sure where in the bed had been harvested before, so looks like this bed has been mostly cropped out. There's a little bit down on the end there, but this is good stuff. I mean, I'm really happy that we harvested the greens off these carrots now, because it's going to make harvesting them so much easier, because you can see how I can clearly see my rows, and when you watch me harvest, you're going to see why that's important, because you can shank the carrots if you can't see the rows clearly. So
By shank the carrots, he means like break off part of the bottom of the carrot with like your digging fork or shovel that you're using. That can lower your quality of carrot, means you might not get as much money for them. People want to see a nice carrot that's like all the way whole from top to bottom. I mean, you can get, like, I found, in most farmers markets, you can get away with a little bit of not everything being perfect. But it is a nice, if you can avoid doing it, it's good. Just because also that's a great way to add, like, if you damage your carrot, that introduces dirt and possible contamination there too. So if you can keep it whole, that's better. But so we'll just like sort of
worked out great. So
skip ahead for
in
you.
this case, because once there's a thick blanket of snow on there, it actually insulates the ground and prevents it from freezing. So that is the key there. So let's get in the dirt and see what we find.
Yeah, so because he's kept it from freezing, it's easy for him to use his digging fork to dig up. He's loosening the carrots. He's going to come in and pull them all out once the soil's loose. I think we'll just skip ahead to the end here, because then he's going to end up having
the ground, and then I'm using a 6 mil greenhouse poly to cover all this up, and then I'm using weights. We have little stone cement pavers that we've got on the ends, as well as little 1-inch spring clamps to clamp the plastic down on certain parts. So those are the main things you need, and then you're just planting carrots into a bed and covering them up before it gets too cold, and then we come back in here and cut the greens off. And so that's it. So I hope that helps, and you can have, if you try this stuff, you can have carrots all winter long. And I'm telling you, these taste better than any time of year, because they get sweet in the winter, perfect for juicing, perfect for making stews. Beautiful stuff.
Yeah, so they get sweeter because sugar is an antifreeze. The more sugar or something that's dissolved in the water in the plant cells, basically sugar dissolves in water, and when water has dissolved solids in it, it needs to be an even lower temperature in order to freeze. So that's oftentimes why you'll hear and see that a lot of your vegetables will be sweeter after a frost, or if they've been in the cold for a long time. So we kind of skipped. I guess I missed where he talked about, like, he harvested about a 10-foot section of that bed and got between 50, 80 pounds of carrots. So
when's the best time to plant the carrots?
yeah, for overwintering, For us, it'll be kind of similar to when he planted it, like, early to mid-August. If you want to harvest them over the winter. You could plant them a little bit later and they'll survive over winter, but you won't be able to harvest them until the spring and once we get more light and they start growing up. So as an example, we have one of the folks out here, they have some carrots. They're growing up nicely outside, but they're not going to be ready to harvest before really winter actually sets in. But we'll cover them and probably sometime in April, maybe early May, they'll be ready to dig out. So if it's something like a carrot that'll survive over winter, I think it depends on how cold we get. Since we only really have like the fabric, if we get a really cold winter, that might end up killing them. We can see if maybe we can get access to some poly to protect these ones that we've got. But yeah. Cheryl and her group have like one row of carrots. That are, like I said, they're looking quite nice. Their tops look really good. Since we just have the fabric, again, I'm not 100% sure. They should live through the winter, but we'll have to see. We'll have to see how cold it gets. We'll have to see how just how they do. I think if we can get access, if we can get some plastic, that'll be better because then we can really reduce the chances of the soil freezing. Because again, moisture will get through that fabric. So that's not going to protect like this does, protecting the soil from freezing because it's not going to prevent the moisture from getting through. So we talked about low tunnels. So the next step up are what are called caterpillar tunnels. And so these are just a couple different pictures. You can sort of think of them as just sort of almost like a bigger version of a low tunnel. They're big enough to stand up in, but they're less permanent than a high tunnel or a greenhouse. These are usually very simple. They're tall. You can get ones that are, so there's this round type is called a Quonset style. And then this one, which has that pointed top, is the Gothic style. And they sell these in kits. You can make your own. There's a number of different options for it. Again, like these will be, you're going to want some way to raise the plastic to ventilate, especially if you have these up at the beginning of the season and going into the fall. But these are a nice thing to have, or going into the spring, I should say. It's nice that you can stand up inside them. They're a lot easier to work in that way, but then you're using more material, so it is going to be more expensive to build. The Gothic style, because of that peaked roof, is really nice if you are in an area that gets heavy snow, because that'll shed the snow better. With Quonset style, just the rounded, if you have a heavy snowstorm, it's often a good idea to go out there with like a push broom and, pull or push the snow off. Because again, as that weight builds up and it keeps going, then you're likely to get a tear. We can compare that to high tunnels. So those are usually they're just basically bigger. Oftentimes they'll have the arches will actually have bracing that is hammered into the ground. It's not concrete or anything like that. You can always pull them up. So they are considered temporary structures for the purposes of zoning and things like that. They're not a permanent structure, but they have more hardware than a caterpillar tunnel. You can see this one here has this wooden bracing on the bottom, as well as all the posts are driven into the ground. This one even has a vent. The sides roll up on these. There's just a lot more hardware in here. So again, they're correspondingly more expensive, but then they're also sturdier. They're usually bigger and things like that. Now there are, so for caterpillar tunnels and high tunnels, there are NRCS cost share programs. So you can talk to the county NRCS agent, once you've gotten your farm registered with the FSA, and talk about potentially getting, applying for some of that funding. And again, so the bigger your tunnel, so going from your low tunnels to your caterpillars to your high tunnels, the bigger it gets, basically the more stable the temperature is going to be. A small tunnel will warm up fast, cool down fast. A bigger tunnel will take a little longer to warm up, but it'll stay warmer for longer after like the sun goes down. So those are just some things to consider. You know, then we've talked about how we have greenhouses, which are where you've actually got the actual climate control, where you have like heaters and AC and maybe lights and things like that. For the most part, if we're doing stuff, you know, on the small scale in an urban lot, low resource, lot of high upfront cost, we're probably not going to be having greenhouses. You know, you might, there are, I'll show you a video where Curtis Stone is doing some very minimal heating in a high tunnel. And he actually he has a high tunnel that's more of it's almost a greenhouse because he uses, so typically, you know, we look at these ones, right? So this high tunnel, this caterpillar tunnel, they're just single layers of that 6 mil poly film. You could do double layer. So, and then inflate it or use spacers, and then you've got air as an insulator, and so that really holds the heat in really well. But then you're not able to roll up the sides for ventilation, so you really have to have some sort of fan ventilation set up, essentially, and good airflow. But you know, you can have, so the video I'll show you, he has like a little space heater, basically. Well, I mean, it's not a space heater. It's a small like overhead hanging heater. But if you want to really minimize your energy usage, you're keeping the temperature just barely above freezing. And that way that'll keep your crops living. And I'll just sort of show you that. So there are so we talked about some other season extension things. So we've talked about before how plastic mulch can increase your season. We've talked about cold frames. Usually these are going to be, so this one's made out of some old windows and just some pieces of wood. Again, it's got to have these little props so they can ventilate it well. Those are ways where if you've got a small area, you can get some additional oomph out of it. So Dana came up with this really nice table here. So your fabric row cover, yeah, so it's about 10 cents per square foot. You can get up to 2 months later in the fall or 2 to 4 weeks earlier in the spring. But wind can be a real nuisance. So the thing about the row cover is it tears. So even if you have it weighted down, if you get a strong enough wind, you might actually just tear the row cover in half sometimes. So that's one risk with row cover. Yeah, different ways to provide different levels of protection. The plastic row cover is about twice as expensive, but you can actually really get that year-round production because you're keeping that moisture off the soil. Now, by year-round production, it means, again, I mentioned your light and the temperatures outside mean you're not really getting a whole lot of growth in the winter. So that means you have to plan appropriately, and we'll talk about that Curtis Stone will talk about that in the video. So your caterpillar tunnel, again, like that's about $1.50 to $2 per square foot. So that's, you know, almost 10 times as expensive as the low cover, or low tunnel, I should say. But it's really easy to move the caterpillar tunnels, and it's easy to work in because then you can get underneath and walk in them. High tunnels even more expensive, but there are mobile options. They're usually stationary, but you can automate them. You can heat them a little bit. The greenhouse, again, is just very expensive, $15 to $20 per square foot because you're doing a lot of temperature control. Really only good for like the really high value crops, and probably none of us, including myself, are probably going to really want to invest the money in a greenhouse when we can make do with the much cheaper option and get just about as good of results with appropriate planning. Plastic mulch, so that black plastic or white plastic or things like that, you know, as long as you're doing transplants, you know, that's a very, very cheap option, and you might get a little extra 1 or 2 weeks on the ends of your seasons just because it's absorbing the heat, it's keeping some moisture, it's trapping moisture that's in there, but it's not letting a whole lot of excess come back added to it, and it just keeps it a little warmer. So I'm going to pull up another, or I guess before I pull up another video, any questions so far? Okay, so this is a nice video of like some basic principles of winter farming.
Of what's happening in here right now, and it's pretty cool. We've got lots of production. Right now, we've been harvesting in here. So Mark has already harvested, he harvested this bed here yesterday. He harvested half of that bed over there a couple weeks ago, and we've got some regrowth coming back in there, starting to come back. And we've got we've got 4.5 nice thick beds of lettuce here, and they're kind of increasing their yield as time goes on. So the first bed that Mark harvested was a light yield because it wasn't as mature, but now these are growing pretty consistently that by the time we harvest another one of these beds, it should be about 40 pounds per bed. The target, of course, is 50 pounds per 50-foot bed, and in the summer in our main growing season, that's what we yield on Salanova beds. We get 1 pound per linear foot of bed, so that's the target. And you know, lesson learned there is we could have planted it earlier. Having said that, we were kind of pushing it to the max on getting this greenhouse up in time, getting the stuff planted before the greenhouse is even up, and you know, go back on the vlogs in October and you'll see that whole process. Eventually I'll make a video piecing together with the construction of this greenhouse, but that's going to take a bit of time. It's quite a bit of a edit job putting all those videos together. So now that we're in here, I just want to give you guys a little tour of how this thing is set up. And right now I'm very satisfied on how it's been running. So we've got electrical in this greenhouse. We've got I believe it's a 40 amp heater. Run during the evening or when it gets cool. And that's the big idea the main idea with winter farming is that you have crops that get set in anywhere between the late summer to the late fall, and you keep those crops alive throughout the winter because things just don't grow in the same way in the winter as they do in the main season unless you supplement light and put in a lot of inputs. And so if you're doing minimal inputs, you're relying on the light that you have available, and right now we're at about 8 hours of daylight. So that's not a lot for things to grow quickly, though with the supplemental heat, it is enough for them to grow a little bit. But if I were to direct seed a crop in here right now, it would take a long time to mature. It probably wouldn't be mature until February, so it's not really worth it. But you can even see I've got a half bed here of red Russian kale and tatsoi. If you guys check out the video I did direct seeding with the Jang seeder, I'll put the link up here. You can see me plant that, and so I direct seeded that. It was sometime in October. I think the greenhouse is mostly up at that point. And this crop is probably ready to harvest in a couple weeks. So continuing on here, so that was our heater. While I was gone, Mark installed...
Okay, I can't remember exactly where in the video this is, but what I want to talk about is what he mentioned. So yeah, things aren't really growing in the winter. What you want to be doing if you're planning for winter harvest is you basically want to plan ahead and say, all right, you know, how many weeks of harvest do I need? How much space do I want to like harvest every week, and how much would I want to get out of it? So, you know, he usually does about like, he says his goal is like a pound of lettuce per linear foot of bed. So if you think, okay, well, if that's his goal yield, you know, maybe a more modest, you know, for just getting started, maybe let's say your goal is like 1/3 of a pound per foot, maybe half a pound. If you can get a full pound, awesome, great, that's cool. But so it's all about planning ahead of time, planting it with the anticipation that it's going to take longer to grow, and that when you cut it, basically, so, you know, we talk about this with like the baby salad greens. We have some out there. You know, in the summer and the spring, you can cut that and then come back a week later, maybe a week and a half, and it's already grown all the way back, and you get the same yield week after week from the same spot until you've exhausted that plot, maybe after 3, 4, maybe even 5 cuts. With winter farming, you're basically going to cut that once, and you might not get a second cutting until months later. So you want to basically, if you want to say, all right, I want to take 30 pounds of lettuce to the market every week, that means you got to say, all right, I want to do 30 pounds a cut. That's going to take me, let's say, 30 linear feet. And I've got from the end of October through the beginning of April. So let's say, so that's November, December, January, February, March, and then April. So that's, well, that's like basically 4 or 5, well, let's say 4 to 6 months. So that means you would need, you can really think like, you might end up, you basically need to say, I might get 1, possibly 2 cuts out of each bed. And then so you have to plan like, okay, if I want to have a 30 pounds each week times, let's say 16 weeks, so that's, what is it, 100, 6 times 3, or let's see, it's 30 feet times 16, so that's 30, so that's 300 plus 6, so that's like 500, like 500 something feet of bed, essentially, is really what you need. So that means you need a plan that like you're going to have however many row feet of bed for the total amount that you want for that whole season, basically planned out and planted in anticipation that you're going to not harvest, you're only going to harvest it once or maybe twice over the course of the season. So I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense. He explained it well in one part of the video, but now I thought it was in this video. It might be in the other one. But essentially you almost have to treat the crop as if it's not a cut and come again crop, as if it's just a one-time harvest, though you will get a second harvest out of it once the daylight comes back up. So it's really about planning out what you actually want to bring to market, putting it into the space, letting it mature, and then only cutting as much as you need. So if you have a smaller space, like let's say you were me in my side yard, and I've got maybe like 60 feet of bed that I could have. If I wanted stuff for a winter market, so let's say actually I know that like, so the Springfield market doesn't have its winter market doesn't start till January. So if I wanted to actually have salad stuff for January, I probably wouldn't do lettuce because I don't have a heated tunnel. Even if he's only keeping it at like 38, 40 degrees, I still just don't have that. So if I was doing a low tunnel, I'd probably do something like kale, spinach maybe, something a little hardier, and I might plant that, beginning of October, second week of October, anticipating that it's going to grow up and it's basically going to stop for like 2 months, and then I'll harvest it in January, and it'll probably be a little small. And let's say if I'm going from January to March with that, and if they're doing a market every week, that's like 12 markets. I have 60 feet. I might only do at most like 10 foot of bed a week and just get what I can get. And then by the time I get 6 weeks, maybe my first one will be ready to cut again. It's really going to depend on your site, how much shade it gets, how much sun it gets, what the temperature is. If you're doing stuff with low tunnels, if you can control temperature at all, that's a real big bonus. But like we mentioned with the carrots and things like that, just keeping the moisture off can really make a huge difference in and of itself. And keeping the ground from freezing can really make things live a lot longer. Yeah.
So is doing, there's a lot more cost with doing this as winter versus when the weather is much better.
Yes.
Is it still as profitable? I mean, the market is much higher during the winter time?
So usually most of these growers that are doing this, they will definitely charge higher prices during the winter for sure. And the demand is there. If you can bring fresh produce to your local, you have to know your market. And you have to go there, and if you're the only person with fresh cut lettuce, and there's not like a hydroponic operation that's also selling at the same market, who are going to be really beating you on cost of production probably. But if you're one or maybe one of 2 or 3 people at most with lettuce, you'll probably sell it. You'll sell it. People love the salad.
And then is the flavor profile different compared to like the carrots?
Yeah, you are going to see sweeter, especially if you don't have a heated space. Like if you are doing like kales or collards or something in a low tunnel, where again it's not going to freeze as hard unless it gets really cold. They are going to get sweeter because they do need to protect themselves. If you were doing like he is in this tunnel where he's got it heated to like 38, 40 degrees, it is still going to be a bit sweeter because again, it is going to get cold in there and probably, it might not always be 100% efficient like the heating. Like, temperatures, if it drops really suddenly at night, it's going to take a while to warm back up. So yeah, you would expect at least some sort of flavor profile difference, probably sweeter for most of the things that'll grow in this.
I was also thinking you probably have less cost with pesticides.
Yeah. Yeah, there's very few winter pests that you have to deal with if you aren't heating, or if you're very minimally heating. Now, if you had like a full-on greenhouse where you're keeping it at like 60 something, or even 70 over winter, then you're going to have pests because there are plenty of things that like it that warm. But there's a lot fewer that like it in the high 30s and low 40s. You still might see something, but you're absolutely right. There's going to be definitely less pest pressure from outside pushing in. That's for sure. So I guess the key thing I wanted to emphasize is that if you want to farm vegetables over winter, it really requires planning. You have to plan ahead how much you want to take to market, how much space you think you're going to need, how much space do you have, and really think about that when you need to plant it. So really, this is why a lot of times why we do our crop planting in the spring, so we can have an idea of when things are going in. And then when weather screws us over and we don't get to plant things on time, it's still okay. But we know at the end of the season where if I might have planned 3 rotations through a single bed, and then I wanted to do an overwinter rotation, but because of the springtime was so wet, I didn't get to plant until late. I only got 2. It might mean that you say, okay, if I want to do winter, I might need to cull a crop early in order to plant in time. And so, you have to make that decision about whether or not that's worthwhile based on what crop you're talking about. Like just as an example, so I've got tomatoes growing still. I'm still getting ripening tomatoes. They're doing really kind of just fine. Some of them have died back a little bit, some varieties, but a lot of other ones, a lot of my cherries are still really going strong. But I'm probably going to pull them out early, even though I'm still getting tomatoes, because I want to put my cover crop in and have it time to actually grow before it gets cold. So I don't have a market that I'm selling to right now, so that's okay for me. At this point, I've got a giant bag of dried cherry tomatoes and probably about 50 or 60 pounds of tomatoes in the freezer that I'm going to turn into sauce. I don't think I need any more right now. But if I had a market to sell those, then I could be making money off them. But I think at this point, I can look at my analysis and say, all right, these aren't really doing me any good. I'm not really getting a lot of personal benefit out of them. I'm definitely not getting a financial benefit. So I might as well just pull them out. Even though they're still growing, they'll probably grow until we actually get a frost. And then, again, you have to do the same thing. If I was growing, so out there in the field, we got some people, they just got I want to say 16, 20 pounds of green beans out of their plot. And they're probably going to get that much again next week because this was a late planting of beans and it's still nice and warm. So, if they want to say, I don't really feel like doing the beans, they could just pull out those plants and plant something else instead, plant a winter crop, plant a cover crop. Or it might have been if they really wanted to. So again, most of these crops, for like carrots, he's planting in August because they're a slow to mature crop. If you want an overwinter green, you might plant middle of September, beginning of September, or potentially even beginning of October, depending on what you're wanting. So I think he was mentioning these greens were planted in October for some of them. So again, it all depends on, your days to maturity in the crop and how you're managing it. But yeah, winter farming requires planning, but it is a lot easier. You don't really have to water because you're not getting as strong as sunlight. Your things aren't getting as hot. You may still have to water. I mean, it's always important to go check your soil every day, see that it's moist, but you're going to have to water a lot less than in the summer. That's for sure. You're not really going to have to deal with weeds. The weeds aren't going to be growing. The seeds aren't really going to be germinating. So weeding is a lot less of an issue. It's kind of I don't want to say it's quite set it and forget it, but it almost is. If you get the prep right, you get your timing right. Once the winter rolls in, it's really just going in there, harvesting, and then taking it to market. You're not turning beds over really, so it's actually it's fairly relaxed. And certain crops in the other video about winter farming that he has, and I'll have a list of these videos posted in the handouts, so if you wanted to watch them, or you could just search his YouTube channel. There's a lot of, he does some microgreens in his actual greenhouse over winter without supplemental light, and because there's not a whole lot of light, they actually stretch, because it's called etiolation. It's where the plants are trying to reach light. And so then what happens is that you get actually more yield that way from microgreens, because then they're just more stem. And because they're micros, though, it's tender, so that's okay if it's extra stem. So yeah, really that's mostly it, unless you want to watch this 15-minute video on the basic principles of winter farming, which kind of goes over what I just talked about, but with a little bit more detail. I was going to go out and take some soil samples. If folks wanted to help with that, we can do it. But it's not a huge deal if you wanted to get home. Again, this was a fairly quick class. Just key points is there's a lot of options to do that are fairly low cost. You can get more complicated the more money you want to spend, but there's a lot we can do just with low tunnels and frames and things like that. So, and then we've got the wire hoops. That's also an option. So you can get 9-gauge wire, or you can get the pre-cut hoops to put on plastic or the fabric. That's another option. But that's really all I got for you today, unless you have any more questions.